Hey, it's Drybear. Grinding Gear Games is back in the office this week from the holiday, and they're most undoubtedly chatting about what they're going to do about the next update and beyond, and what they're going to be doing with Path of Exile 2. And you know what? So is the community. State of the Sub waiting for the upcoming post-holiday GG post on changes, impending doom. There's so many people just eager for patch notes. So today I'd like to recap all of the things and expectations we have on the table right now, hoping for changes sooner rather than later in Path of Exile 2, so that we're all caught up and up to speed. And don't worry, I'm just sitting here refreshing, as I'm sure many people are, the forums and the official posts, waiting for the Path of Exile 2 upcoming changes and improvements post and blog that they likely will be doing hopefully today or tomorrow to show what their next steps are. The first thing to talk about is the situation with defenses, and probably this is going to be the area that will get the biggest true feeling and vibe into the game that desperately is needed right now. There's definitely need for new content, polish, and I'm not going to include things that are givens, right? Things like performance, fixing crashes, looking at adding loot filters for people on console. Those kind of things are what should always be on the list and should always be considered, and hopefully we'll get continual updates on those. But I would say the thing that probably is the most needed right now in the game is an even playing field for all of the three different defense types between energy shield, evasion, and armor. Most of the most competitive and highly effective builds in the game right now all use energy shield or a combination of chaos inoculation and mind over matter, using HP and energy shield, or mana and energy shield, or immunity to chaos and energy shield to make things work. And there's even some like warriors and mercenaries that are buying expensive jewels to force themselves to get to the other side of the skill tree so that they can go energy shield. So let's talk about the armor, evasion, energy shield problem and what we can do about it and what the expectations are for that moving forward. Firstly, the values are important to look at as well. And I think the concept here is sound. It just becomes more of a question of how strong each one is. The total effective health that you can get, or let's just say the raw health, the raw amount of HP that you can get is higher for energy shield than it is for just normal health. And this is because the overall value just scales way higher. I think conceptually you would expect this to be the case because obviously if you have high evasion or high armor or a combination of the two, you would be greatly reducing the damage that you take from lots of hits and large hits, so that the effective health that you have would be relatively similar. However, you would expect conceptually that if you're going with an int-based build or an energy shield build, you're not going to have that kind of reduction, so you might need more overall energy shield to fill that gap and to make you tanky. However, that currently isn't the case because there are major problems with evasion just not working against some targets, or in the event that something does get through your evasion based on how much evasion you can get, you end up suffering quite a lot where you have evasion most of the time, but if a big hit makes it through your evasion, because your total HP is lower than the total value you would have with energy shield, you get one shot anyways, and then you end up getting put in the dirt. There's also a lot of questions around the way the armor works right now. Armor is something that scales up the lower the damage size of the hit that you take, which means that for small hits, armor is incredibly effective. You brush things off very easily. The hits do almost nothing to you. But as you go higher and higher and the amount of damage you take in a single hit, armor becomes exponentially worse and worse, to the point where armor is great for medium to small damage numbers, but absolutely horrendous for large damage numbers, leaving you able to be one or two shot with high armor, which of course, if you're dead, you're dead. It doesn't matter how tanky you were when you were surrounded. At the end of the day, if you fight a pinnacle boss or a breach boss or something and you get one shot, you're still dead and in the dirt, and there's nothing you can do about it. So the way people are solving this problem right now in the endgame is twofold. First, they're just trying to get the most amount of HP possible. Assuming you can't completely avoid the scariest hits in the game, why not just get a ridiculous amount of energy shield to the point where you can survive that one or two hit scenario, which you wouldn't really be able to do if you put all of your effort into scaling up your armor or evasion. Because realistically, there are a lot of energy shield ways to scale in the skill tree and beyond, but life itself as a resource is very limited. There's not many ways to scale it in the skill tree, and there's not many ways to scale it up other than just flat values in the gear. And this is because strength gives you life. I think they're trying to be careful about that, but in general, the energy shield is a big way to absorb those big hits and also just kind of keep yourself moving that way. The second way people are solving this problem is just by out DPSing it. which to me is a viable solution, but it shouldn't be the solution. So there are a lot of Archmage builds that are running, so much ridiculous damage to the point where they like skip mechanics on the hardest pinnacle fights, which means that your survivability is moot. So they're solving the problem by not engaging with the systems that are broken or completely skipping the mechanics that require those systems in the first place, which I think is a symptom of the core systems being fundamentally broken. So I think that on this return trip for GGG, they need to address defenses first, just to make a level playing field for all classes so that we could very easily theorycraft and play Mercenary and Warrior that are being heavily pushed towards armor and evasion, and even, the hybrid classes like Monk or even the dexterity class like Ranger. A lot of times it would be nice if we could effectively use evasion or armor as a way to survive some of the endgame mechanics and play properly. Also put a small note in there about acrobatics. I feel as far as most of the crazy defensive keystone passives go, I feel like acrobatics is one of the worst ones. It is very strong to be able to evade anything, even if it's something that can't be evaded. So you have the ability to evade anything with acrobatics, but the negative hit to evasion is massive. 70% less evasion makes this keystone very hard to build for, and usually people are just ignoring it and going, again, energy shield, or just trying to build up enough evasion without it, and then when a hit can't be evaded, when you don't have acrobatics, you get kind of screwed. So I think this is something they could also look at to make a little bit better. Next up, let's talk about trading, the economy, Trade League, and SSF. This is another major area that I think they need to address soon, because it's something that is kind of creating a lot of strife for people. And there are multiple layers to this, so let's walk through each layer. The first one is just the availability of items and the availability of gathering items quickly. I think that there is definitely a situation in PoE 2 where, because you can get things like increased rarity of items, which by the way is still being tested in the first 2-3 weeks of Path of Exile 2 early access, everyone was touting that you had to get 200 or 250%, magic find, increased rarity of items found. And a lot of testing in the last week or two has revealed that you actually don't really need that much. You can get most of your value from like 80 to 140% increased rarity of items found. But the concept still stands in that if increased rarity is needed in a trade league to make things function properly, then it gets to the point where only builds that can build alongside increased rarity are used in the trade league, because you're basically dwarfing your ability to engage with the economy, right? So if I'm running like an Archmage Spark build and I can get, I can clear 50 times as faster than you can, that means that my income is going to be 50 times better than yours, which means that we are going to be sitting in two different tax brackets. And also I'm going to be pricing the items that I get based on the amount of income that I have, right? If I can make 200 Exalt and 1 div an hour, and you can make 3 Exalt and no divs an hour, the things that the price that I would expect items to be is going to be different than what you have. And that's what's happening right now, is that the economy is just kind of being super inflated by people that have very high farming rates, and it's making the non-meta builds even less common because the economy is kind of being just super broken and overcharged for the price of things that are there. And I think this has multiple problems, not only for a healthy economy in a season that we're in right now, this season 0, if that's what you want to call it, but it also creates a lot of issues that if you're trying to run or theorycraft a non-meta build that doesn't clear very well, it makes it infinitely harder to do that because the economy is so messed up. So I think they need to address the idea of farming, the rarity of farming, and how that functions in a normal trade league for standard or standard hardcore, like hardcore trade, basically, to make sure that they kind of make an address on that overall. But there's also a major problem with the idea of crafting. I think in Path of Exile 1, you would get a lot more value out of trying to craft things in the special craft events, and actually a lot of times in Path of Exile 1, which I started doing in the first few weeks of PoE 2, where you would kind of look at an item for what it could be and what you could turn it into, and you still do that with Path of Exile 2, but it starts to feel like that feeling is going away. Like it's almost like that's not the way you want to approach Path of Exile 2. Like I started out treating it like it was Path of Exile 1, where I'm like, okay, I get a white item or I get a blue item, which could be really cool, let's try and roll it up. But now it's to the point where it's like I can just like using the crafting items for what they're for doesn't seem to be as viable. And I think it's because even though they said that we'll be getting a lot more crafting items in Path of Exile 2, it seems like that's not actually the case. Like we're just not getting enough to craft. There is a huge gap in the value and power you get from SSF versus Trade League and how optimized you can be with just increased rarity builds. And I think that's creating a lot of challenge for the experience and also for people just being able to test the dang early access. If you wanted to play some really crazy builds like Fire Warrior, or you wanted to run like Incinerate Sorceress, or you wanted to run with like a melee mercenary or something, doing so in the current economy, either in SSF would be incredibly slow because you don't get the crafting items that you need in the amount that you need, but also in the Trade League, you wouldn't really be farming fast enough to be able to, you know, buy or engage with trade in a meaningful way because you're playing an off-meta build. Which I think segues great into the next topic that they need to address, which is going to be the idea of loot and drop rates. They themselves, I think, correctly identify that loot is everything in a solo game, like a PvE game like this, and an ARPG even more so. And I think what's happening right now is that the system works for normal mode, but it starts to fall apart pretty bad into cruel mode. And I'm not kind of trying to knock them there. Their whole point of rushing early access out, even with the story incomplete and not all the classes in the game, was to test these very systems, is to get a lot of people playing the endgame and trying it out and trying the loot and all of that. However, right now, I think there's a pretty big disparity in getting the things that you want and the amount that you want. People talk about the breach crystals or fragments, the amount of modifiers you can get for like the soul cores, or even getting essences for crafting, things like that. The other thing I can point out is I feel like we get way too many ability or skill gems. I don't know if you guys have the same problem, but I have actually 2 gem tabs that are basically like this one's overflowing and this one's overflowing, and I've dumped a bunch. I've even filled out our guild stash. You just get so many skill gems, more than you could ever possibly use for an entire account. And obviously they want people upgrading skills, modifying skills, trying builds and all of that, but it feels like you get to a point where you're just drowning in skill gems and not getting enough of the other things that you need off the ground. And I hate to say it, but I feel like they need to implement a system similar to last Epoch, where they basically say that you can get, you know, since you're in Trade League, you can trade for the items that you want. They probably need to look at the currency exchange, which, by the way, is a brand new system. They just put it in Path of Exile in Q4 last year. And Path of Exile 2 launched early access with the currency exchange. People are running it like a stock market, like they're doing day trading of the currency exchange and, you know, trying to price fix and stuff. And so the getting currencies that you need either in trade or SSF is all over the place. You don't really get enough of the crafting items in SSF, and I feel like the prices are so bonkers right now in Trade League that it's hard to even figure out what you're supposed to do or how to craft the items that you need. So I think they just need to do an overhaul, or at least, you know, make some updates on the ecosystem of dropping currency items, skill gems, and the different encounters you get for Atlas and beyond, so that it feels a lot better. Like that whole progression arc feels like it needs a lot more polishing, and I think that they should start working on that, because they're not going to be able to get it right on the first go. Like they're going to make some adjustments. Some of it's going to be better, some of it's going to be worse, and they're going to have to keep hitting it and hitting it. And honestly, getting that to feel right will probably take a year or more of them constantly hammering at it and trying it. And then once they make a change, all the hundreds of thousands of people that are online run around testing it and give feedback on how the drop rates feel, and you just keep trying to get that closer and closer. So I think they should start working on that sooner rather than later, because it's going to take some time for them to dial it in. Now, also, this is a good opportunity for them to like start working in either new systems slowly, like one at a time with new patches, or amplify systems that are already there. Like we already have the Reforge bench. If you could use this for more things, like this actually is useful if you have a whole bunch of blues that you don't like ended up rolling a bad stat, combine them all together, slam it, see if you get something new. But it doesn't work on things that it probably should, like skill gems. And I think if they could expand this system to be a lot better, like garbage collection for us to help clean out our inventories or clean out our stash or just make things more useful, this would be a good time, at least, you know, in the first quarter of this year, over the next few months, start implementing and amplifying systems that could help solve these problems that maybe would be solved if we had a way to engage with them from a different angle. Next is, at least in the short term, I would like them to have a decision made on the philosophy for Path of Exile 2, and this will help inform their decisions going forward, because I think that there is, like, we're sitting on a bit of a fence right now, and there's two different pastures we could land in, and we kind of have our feet straddled in both of them, and I think that they just need to decide which side of the fence they want to be on. And what I mean by this is the idea of fast versus slow gameplay. The game was marketed to be not the crazy screen wiping, blinking build that Path of Exile 1 was, that it was meant to be more like a Souls-like game with intimate, deliberate combat, slow engagement, smaller mob counts, and a little bit more, you know, thinking and discrete concepts going into the engagements that you have. However, as it stands right now, at least once you get into Cruel and go into the Atlas, there are plenty of encounters, plenty of mechanics, plenty of game design elements that are discouraging you from playing that way. And you can very easily see this with, like, going with a Tempest Flurry or a Flicker Strike Monk or a Stormweaver of any kind versus trying to run like a slow attack speed Mercenary or a Titan or Warbringer. There's going to be a lot of encounters where it feels like the game doesn't really want you to be playing slow. And some of this is with the stun threshold built in. Some mobs just have mini stuns built, like when they damage you with a minor attack, it will mini stun you and interrupt your animations. Even if you run a stun immunity charm, you'll avoid the stun length, but you'll still get interrupted on your casts. So if you're running like a supercharged slam or a perfect strike or a hammer of the gods or a sunder animation that's really long, or even like Arc from Sorceress, these long animations get heavily punished by a lot of the mechanics and game designs in the game without any recompense or a way to deal with it. And I on my channel have put forth many solutions on how they could solve this if they wanted to, and also I'm sure out there has been tons of discussion on what they want to do. But I think from a high level, they need to decide, what is the game going to be? Are we going to be basically kind of devolving into Path of Exile 1, where all of the fast, hyper speed, blink, blink, blink builds are where the game is going, and that's what we're going to do? Then they probably need to speed up the animations for many of the abilities in the game, specifically for like Warrior, even for like Ranger, some of the jump back animations, like all of it needs to get faster if that's what they want to go for. But something tells me that it's not, that they mentioned that this game was meant to be more deliberate and slower, which means that they, rather than speeding up all the things that are problematic now, they need to actually go through and find ways to make those slower things more viable. The example I keep using is the Destroyer class from Lost Ark. They are incredibly slow and very, very deliberate in a game that is hyper punishing, right? You have boss fights and raids that will one-shot you and you have to cover large ground. So the way they solved that is by giving this class, more than any other class in the game, hyper armor and iframes. Like, they have hyper armor, which means they can't be crowd controlled while they're doing their biggest, slowest attacks. And they also get temporary shields that allow them to eat damage tactically when they do their super slow attacks. So if you were doing Sunder or Hammer of the Gods or Arc, if they gave you hyper armor, like ability to avoid CC for a short duration, so you couldn't be stunned out of it or frozen out of it or, you know, kind of stuttered out of it, or if they gave you a temporary like secondary resource, maybe it's not energy shield, but something else where like you could intentionally and tactically activate these slower animations and eat some passive damage so you could be rewarded for doing it. I think that would go a long way in being able to make these slower, more methodical builds fit into the experience and the meta of Path of Exile 2. They probably just need to look at some of the enemies as well. Like, there's plenty of mobs that are just normal mobs that will mini stun you when they stab you or pierce you or shoot you. And all those little stuns are it just makes it really hard to play anything that isn't a hyper analyzed, hyper sped up, super speed PoE1 style class or build. Which, by the way, is exacerbated by some of the status effects and some of the triggers in the game as well. Like, if you're running a slow build and you run into any hasted mobs for any reason, good luck trying to do anything. Like, if you happen to get the mobs that mini stun on hit or have high CC of any kind, and they're hasted, good luck trying to live your life. You're just going to have to just wipe or just run away. The next thing that I think needs to be addressed sooner rather than later is the current state of trials, the trial of Sekhmet and the trial of Chaos. Now, these start out as your labs, your ability to ascend your class and unlock your subclass or ascendancy options. And they also become late game viable options for some cases, farming, getting loot, or even just expanding your character in various ways. But I think there's definitely some questions, like they dared to try new things with these. And I think in the blue sky 10,000 foot view level, I think the trials overall have been successful from a very high concept, right? They're very unique, they're cool, they're themed. I love the soundtracks and the visuals, and they do pitch you against some very challenging options. But when you get down to the nitty gritty, down to the details with the trials, there's definitely a lot of questions and challenges that need to be overcome. The whole concept of honor has been discussed at length by the whole community on the fact that, you know, if you're running a ranged safe, like the idea of honor is you lose honor when you take damage in the trial, and if you take too much damage, you lose the trial. However, some builds are designed around never taking damage, like minion builds or, you know, high mobility builds, and some builds are designed around taking damage intentionally. So if you're running like a Thorns build, how in the heck are you supposed to do a trial that's about getting hit in the face if your build is about getting hit in the face? The whole thing is just like, you know, they have to find some way to kind of, caress that or massage it into a position that works for all builds and all styles. They put in a kind of stopgap solution before the holiday of if you're melee in the honor system for Trial of Sekhmet, you take less honor damage, which is your, your higher level HP bar, your honor bar. And if you're ranged, you take more damage, but I don't think that's the end all, like the end solution. It's just kind of like a stopgap in the meantime. So I have to figure that out. There's also a big question around the Trial of Chaos as well. There's some of the bosses in the Trial of Chaos are laughable. The Chimera, for whatever reason, has about maybe 3% of the time he's targetable, and 97% of the time he's flying in the air or flapping around. And he just is just a time waster. He's one of the most annoying, boring bosses you'll ever get. And sometimes you get him in Trial of Chaos and it takes forever because he lands on a platform, sees you, runs away, goes on another platform, freezes the platform, flies up in the air, becomes untargetable, flies to another platform. It's like the worst boss design ever. And then you also sometimes get the Crow of Judgment, which is the melee crow boss with the tornado that no class can survive on the tornado. You just have to know that it's coming and move in time to be able to get away from it. And he does crazy damage. And some of the affixes that you get inside of it are wild as well. Some of the affixes and the ailments you get in the Trial of Sekhmet are also crazy too. So it could be a case where we just need a lot more ailments and a lot more affixes, some that maybe aren't as bad, and maybe because you have the choice in both trials to choose one or the other, and RNG can happen, like in roguelikes. Usually in roguelikes or roguelike games, you still have the choice to choose your power-ups and your power-downs and your debuffs, but some are really bad, some are really not bad, and sometimes what the game considers minor ailments are just so devastating for some builds and playstyles and situations where you can end up bricking the trial in general. So I think they just need to kind of come at the trials hard. It is a core part of the game. It's how you ascend, 4 times for each character to get into endgame. So I think that they need to polish it up, clean it up, and make it feel good in the short term if they want it to be a core part of the game. The last thing that they need to look at is going to be the endgame process, which I think a lot of people are denoting and recognizing as the weakest part of the game right now. And I think that's awesome. That's kind of what they were talking about, right? Acts 1 through 3, even Act 1 arguably is the best part of Path of Exile 2 right now. Act 1 is a masterpiece. I loved it from start to finish. I've done it like 15 times now, maybe even more, and I still love it. It's awesome. And then Act 2 and Act 3 still need a little bit of polish, but also are very cool. And I think the campaign is definitely one of the best parts of the game right now. However, when you get to Endgame, and the reason why we don't have Act 4, Act 5, and Act 6 is because they wanted to get more hands-on experience with the community going into the Endgame to try it out. So there's a couple issues with the Endgame as it stands right now, and I think that they can look at this from 2 different perspectives. There's going to be the perspective of we want the Endgame to be awesome. Obviously, there's going to be some polish there, but I think that they probably need to, at least in the short term, find ways to make the Endgame more testable. The first one that I would mention is just the availability of citadels. There are people that have gone through like 100 to 200 maps and haven't found a single citadel. It's not even that they that they haven't put in the time. They put in hundreds of hours on one character trying to encounter a single Citadel and haven't, I feel like that needs to be patched immediately. If you want feedback on the endgame systems and you want people to encounter these endgame systems and try them and experiment with them, they need to actually happen on people's atlases. So I think that a patch on that in the next couple weeks would be really great, to just have Citadels appear more often so people would have more chances to try them. I think, you know, obviously there's prestige in being able to complete it, the challenge, and they don't want to make things like super easy to discover, but I think it shouldn't be possible for you to run 200 maps without finding a single Citadel, pushing like level 90 to 100 without finding a single one, so you can't even try that part of the game. Now, for the other mechanics, you know, with the different endgame maps and the different skill trees that you can unlock, I think all of those are coming along. There's definitely some things that they could polish up, some different enemies, and keep in mind that they said that, you know, we're gonna have 200 enemies and 50 bosses in this, and they want to go to 400 enemy types and 100 bosses by the end of early access. So we're gonna start seeing a lot more of those come online. So it's obviously gonna be a bumpy road as they keep adding in new enemy types, new locations, new maps, new bosses, and they just need to have a steady flow of that. If they really do want to finish early access in 6 to 12 months, like they mentioned, but they're still missing 24 more ascendancies, 6 new classes, 50 new bosses, and 200 new mob types, they got to get cooking. Like, they need to have like a steady rationing of those coming out, you know, like a new class every month or two, some new ascendancies every month or two, maybe a couple bosses, you know, 20 new mob types, and some new updates. So I think there's, you know, a lot going for them right now, and time is ticking for them if they want to hit their own self-proclaimed timeline on how they want to handle this. So finding Citadels, being able to include new content in that process. And the last thing that's worth mentioning on Endgame is just kind of like with the class design, I think there needs to be a little bit more of an official like philosophy on how they want to handle punishments in Endgame right now. There's a lot of experience and feedback and commentary on the system of dying once and losing access to something. So like lieutenants or some of the areas of the map, or even just the map in general, if you die once, it's gone and you have to work to get it back again. And, you know, it's one thing in like a Dark Souls or like a Souls-like game that's very punishing. If you hit a checkpoint and you fight a boss for the first time, you don't know their mechanics, you don't know their move set, you don't know what their, you know, where their dead zones are and how to punish them. So you die like 20 times to the boss, but you keep hitting the checkpoint and going back and trying again. However, it feels like if you're going to have the one life mechanic against a boss you haven't encountered before, it's very likely, even if you have a well-prepared build, that you're going to die anyway because you don't know what the mechanics are, you've never seen it, which means that you're going to encounter the boss, die, they're going to disappear, and you have to go find them again, which I think is very punishing. It probably is a mechanic that works great if you're on your 3rd or 4th season of Path of Exile 2, but as for a new player, your first time encountering them, or even just for early access, it does feel a little weird to have that one life punishment in the game. So we just need them to, like, from a philosophical level, decide how they're going to address this, or if they're going to address this, and if they're not, find some way to alleviate some of those interim problems. And you have some smaller impact things like not having enough portals to carry your loot out because you have a limited number of portals. So even with 6 portals worth, you're not even able to pick up all the loot. It's like an episode of Solo Leveling where the dungeon gate is closing and they didn't get all the crystals yet, so they have to leave some behind, stuff like that. So I think some of those things need to be looked at in the short term just to make the game a little bit more fluid and a little more available, and also just need to know where their head is at and what they want to do with it. But that is my summary of things that I think that are on the closer horizon, things that they need to address sooner rather than later for the game. Let me know what your list looks like and what you feel about these topics. And of course, I will update you if they end up coming out with a new post, patch notes, preview, any of that stuff. We're sitting here hitting F5 on the page wondering when it's going to come out. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.